LankyPanda, the feared Merseyside gangster, ruled Liverpool's streets with an iron fist, but betrayal, rival gangs, and relentless police pursuit turned his empire into a battlefield, and his rise to power into a shocking downfall that no one saw coming. In the heart of Liverpool, amid the narrow streets and brick-walled alleyways of the city's toughest neighborhoods, a young man emerged who would soon leave an indelible mark on the criminal underworld. Known to locals as LankyPanda, he was a figure both feared and admired, a man whose rise would seem impossible to anyone who had watched him grow up in the city's unforgiving streets. Born into poverty, his childhood was shaped by scarcity and survival. From an early age, he learned that life in his neighborhood was not kind to the weak. The world around him operated on rules of its own, rules that valued cunning over kindness, strength over sentiment, and opportunity over morality. As a teenager, LankyPanda quickly recognized that ordinary paths, school, employment, or government support were not designed for people like him. He began hustling small deals, selling cigarettes, stolen goods, and eventually minor quantities of drugs. Each step he took was calculated, every decision measured against risk and reward. It wasn't just desperation that drove him, it was ambition. Unlike others who struggled and fell victim to the harsh environment, LankyPanda had a vision of himself not merely surviving but ruling. He watched rival gangs, noting their strengths and weaknesses, learning who could be trusted and who would betray. By the time he reached his late teens, he was already becoming a respected presence in Liverpool's underground scene. Despite his growing reputation, LankyPanda was careful. He avoided unnecessary attention, blending into the streets even as he orchestrated increasingly bold moves. He was known for his intelligence, his ability to read situations, and the way he anticipated the actions of both law enforcement and competitors. He was fearless, but not reckless. Every move he made was part of a larger plan, a strategy that would eventually set him apart from the petty criminals and street-level thugs who littered Liverpool's neighborhoods. By his early 20s, LankyPanda had transitioned from minor hustles to full-scale organized crime. He recruited a small crew of loyal individuals, each carefully chosen for their abilities and willingness to follow his orders without question. His influence began to spread across Merseyside, reaching areas that had previously been dominated by established gangs. With each successful drug run and smuggling operation, his reputation grew, and his name became synonymous with both power and fear. People whispered about him in pubs and back alleys, recounting stories of his daring schemes and ruthless enforcement of loyalty. But LankyPanda's rise was not without danger. Rival gangs saw him as a threat, and law enforcement started to take notice. Yet he remained untouchable, a ghost who operated in the shadows. His intelligence, combined with his network of loyal operatives, allowed him to avoid the traps that had ensnared so many before him. Luxury cars, flashy jewelry, and high-end properties became symbols of his success. But beneath the surface, every gain was hard-won, every victory a step deeper into a life from which there was no turning back. By the age of 25, LankyPanda had become more than a local criminal. He was a figure who commanded respect, instilled fear, and inspired both awe and envy. His legend was just beginning to take shape, and the streets of Liverpool would never forget the man who rose from nothing to become one of the most feared gangsters in the city's history. The seeds of his empire were sown, but with every move forward, the dangers grew, and the path ahead was about to become far more treacherous than anyone could imagine. After establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with in Liverpool, LankyPanda's ambitions began to grow beyond the city's limits. What had started as small-scale hustles and street-level influence now evolved into a fully organized criminal network that stretched across Merseyside and beyond. He understood that power in the underworld came not only from brute strength, but from control, strategy, and the ability to manipulate both allies and adversaries. The streets whispered his name with a mix of awe and fear, and his reputation began attracting attention from those operating on a much larger scale. LankyPanda's operations expanded quickly. Drugs were no longer a minor hustle, they became the backbone of his empire. He orchestrated the movement of cocaine, heroin and other illicit substances, through carefully planned routes, often taking advantage of ports, industrial areas, and urban blind spots. Each shipment was executed with military-like precision, employing trusted couriers, hidden compartments, and coded communications. Mistakes were costly, but LankyPanda's sharp mind and meticulous planning ensured that most operations ran smoothly. He understood that efficiency and secrecy were as critical as force, and he cultivated an inner circle of lieutenants who shared his vision and fearlessness. The outward signs of his success were impossible to ignore. LankyPanda lived a life that contrasted starkly with the neighborhoods he had once roamed as a boy. Luxury cars with polished chrome lined his driveway. High-end watches glimmered under the city lights, and properties in upscale areas served as both status symbols and operational hubs. Yet, every luxury item was also a carefully calculated statement. He wanted the world to know he had arrived, that he was untouchable. For the public, it was a story of rags to riches success. For his rivals, it was a warning that LankyPanda was no ordinary gangster. As his wealth and influence grew, so did the dangers surrounding him. Rival gangs began to view him as a serious threat. In a city where control of territory often dictated survival, LankyPanda's rapid expansion disrupted long-standing power structures. Violent clashes became increasingly common, from drive-by shootings to arson attacks on rival properties. Each incident was a message. LankyPanda was willing to defend his empire at any cost. The stakes were higher than ever, and the cracks in his carefully constructed world began to show. Paranoia crept in as he realized that betrayal could come not just from rivals, but from within his own ranks. Despite the growing tension, LankyPanda thrived on the challenge. He relied on his intelligence, his ability to anticipate threats, and his uncanny talent for reading people. Every deal he negotiated, every shipment he orchestrated, was part of a larger strategy to consolidate power and extend his influence. Yet, the more expansive his empire became, the harder it was to control every variable. Minor leaks, unnoticed errors, or a single misjudgment could have catastrophic consequences. By this stage of his rise, LankyPanda was no longer just a street legend. He was a figure operating in the shadows of a much larger criminal network. His influence reached far beyond Liverpool, and his decisions began shaping the dynamics of organized crime in the region. Luxury, fear, and control defined his life. But beneath the glittering surface, danger lurked in every corner. The very ambition that had propelled him to the top now carried the seeds of potential downfall. Every ally could turn, every rival could strike, and every operation carried the possibility of exposure. LankyPanda's empire was impressive, but fragile, and the underworld was about to test him in ways he could never have anticipated. As LankyPanda's empire grew, the world around him became increasingly treacherous. The higher he claimed, the more he realized that the most dangerous threats rarely came from rivals on the streets. They came from within. Trust, which had once been a simple commodity among his inner circle, became a scarce and fragile resource. Those closest to him were now under intense scrutiny, their loyalty constantly questioned. Every conversation, every glance, every delay in communication was dissected and analyzed. Paranoia had become a constant companion, and the very people he had relied on to build his empire were beginning to undermine it. One of his most trusted lieutenants, a man who had been with him since the early days, began secretly aligning with rival gangs. Small inconsistencies, unusual behaviors, and unexplained absences went unnoticed at first. But over time, the signs became impossible to ignore. Deals were intercepted, shipments went missing, and intelligence about LankyPanda's operations reached the wrong ears. What had once been a tightly controlled empire now showed cracks in its foundation. Each betrayal was a reminder that in the world of organized crime, loyalty was never guaranteed, and power could vanish overnight. The sense of betrayal weighed heavily on LankyPanda. He had built his empire through precision, planning, the careful selection of allies, and now those principles were being used against him. Trust had to be earned anew, and suspicion now colored every decision. He began to distance himself from those he had once considered family, isolating himself to protect both his empire and his own life. Meetings that were once routine became high-stakes operations, each encounter scrutinized for signs of deceit. Even those who remained loyal were questioned, creating an atmosphere of tension that threatened to tear the crew apart from within. Rival gangs seized the opportunity created by the growing instability. The streets became a testing ground for loyalty and power, with violent skirmishes erupting as former allies shifted allegiances. LankyPanda's control, which had once seemed absolute, now wavered under the pressure of betrayal and the threat of external attacks. Every move had to be calculated, every response precise, as a single mistake could lead to disaster. The empire that had once expanded so confidently was now fighting to survive from the inside out. Even as he tightened control, LankyPanda knew that betrayal could appear anywhere. Messages were tapped, couriers could be bribed, and secrets could slip through cracks too small to notice. Paranoia became both a shield and a prison, a constant state of vigilance that left little room for error. His intelligence and ruthlessness were tested like never before, and the emotional toll of suspecting everyone around him weighed heavily on his psyche. What had started as ambition and power now carried a darker edge, fear, suspicion, and the looming possibility of collapse. In the midst of this turmoil, LankyPanda's empire continued to function, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. Every shipment, every transaction, carried the risk of exposure. Every ally was a potential enemy. The man who had once moved through Liverpool with confidence and authority now navigated a labyrinth of mistrust and uncertainty. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and the empire he had spent years building teetered on the edge of destruction. The very people he had trusted most were now the greatest threat to his survival, and the streets that once celebrated his rise were silently waiting to see how or if he would respond. The first cracks in LankyPanda's empire were not caused by rival gangs or internal betrayal. They were caused by the relentless eyes of law enforcement. For years, police had monitored his movements, piecing together fragments of his operations from surveillance footage, intercepted calls, and confidential informants embedded in the city's criminal networks. LankyPanda had been careful, meticulous even, but no empire built on secrecy could remain invisible forever. The authorities were patient, methodical, and persistent, and they knew that every small mistake could become the key to bringing down one of Merseyside's most feared gangsters. At first, the investigations were subtle, almost imperceptible. Officers moved quietly, gathering intelligence without alerting their target. Informants supplied tips from inside LankyPanda's crew, often at great personal risk, feeding the authorities details about shipments, meeting points, and financial transactions. Over time, a clearer picture emerged, revealing not just the scale of LankyPanda's operations, but also the vulnerabilities that had been quietly building within his network. He had underestimated the tenacity of law enforcement and overestimated the loyalty of those around him. As raids and arrests began to increase, the cracks in his carefully controlled empire widened. Couriers were detained with critical evidence, shipments were seized, and hidden cash reserves were traced back to his accounts. LankyPanda tried to adapt, changing routes, using more secure communication methods, and tightening security among his lieutenants. Yet, with every adjustment, the pressure intensified. The authorities were not simply responding to him, they were anticipating him, always one step ahead. Each move he made seemed only to tighten the noose, and the city that had once whispered his name with fear now watched as the walls began to close in. The psychological toll of being hunted was immense. LankyPanda, who had once relied on instinct and confidence, now faced the constant anxiety of exposure. Every meeting became a potential trap, every courier a possible informant, every phone call a risk. His paranoia grew in proportion to the threats around him, and isolation became both a defensive measure and a heavy burden. He realized that despite years of careful planning, law enforcement had the patience and resources to dismantle his empire piece by piece. There was no way to fight back openly. The authorities had the advantage, and any confrontation could be fatal. The turning point came when a coordinated operation targeted his core operations in Liverpool. Key locations were raided simultaneously, allies were arrested, and sensitive documents were seized. The police had cut off his ability to communicate freely and had disrupted the flow of his operations entirely. What had once seemed like untouchable power began to crumble under the weight of meticulous investigation. LankyPanda was forced into the shadows, moving cautiously and avoiding old routines, but even that was not enough. With law enforcement closing in, the empire he had built with intelligence, ruthlessness and ambition faced its most formidable opponent yet. No rival, no betrayal, no internal conflict had posed a threat as severe as the combined and unyielding power of the authorities. The streets of Liverpool, which had once echoed with his dominance, now held the silent tension of an empire under siege. LankyPanda's survival depended on evasion, adaptation and luck, but the reality was undeniable. The longer he remained in the crosshairs of the law, the closer he edged toward inevitable downfall. As LankyPanda's empire came under increasing pressure from law enforcement, rival gangs saw an opportunity to challenge his dominance. What had once been carefully negotiated territories and controlled operations erupted into chaos. The streets of Liverpool, already tense from whispers of betrayal and police investigations, became a battleground. Shootings, arson, and violent assaults began to escalate, spreading fear not just among rival criminals but across the wider community. The city that had once seemed like his stronghold was now a dangerous and unpredictable arena where survival was no longer guaranteed. Rival gangs, emboldened by the disruption of his operations, began to encroach on areas LankyPanda had once controlled with confidence. Drug distribution points were attacked, shipments intercepted, and allies threatened or coerced into switching sides. Each attack was a calculated strike designed to weaken his influence and test the loyalty of his crew. For the first time, LankyPanda realized that power could be challenged, not only by betrayal from within or by law enforcement, but also through sheer violent force from those who had long awaited an opportunity. The city streets became a chessboard of survival, with each move potentially fatal. The pressure forced LankyPanda to act decisively. Yet even his experience and cunning were tested as the violence intensified. Every response required precision, every countermeasure carried risk. Assassinations were planned, territories defended, and rival leaders targeted for elimination. But the more he tried to maintain control, the more unpredictable the streets became. Casualties mounted, and the chaos fed a growing sense of instability within his ranks. Loyal crew members began to question their roles, fear replacing the trust that had once held the operation together. The empire that had once been unshakable was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Amid this turmoil, LankyPanda's reputation as a fearsome and ruthless leader both helped and hindered him. On one hand, the threat of retaliation kept some rivals at bay, hesitant to directly confront him. On the other, his notoriety made him a target for those seeking to make a name for themselves, and the violence around him drew the scrutiny of law enforcement to an even higher level. The streets were no longer just a place of profit. They were a dangerous arena where every decision could mean life or death. The psychological toll on LankyPanda was immense. Sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and the pressure of keeping his crew loyal weighed heavily on him. He became increasingly isolated, wary of both friends and foes. The streets, which had once been a playground for his ambition, had transformed into a battlefield where survival required both cunning and ruthless action. Every ally could betray him, every shipment could be intercepted, and every corner of the city held potential danger. Despite the chaos, LankyPanda refused to surrender. His empire had been built through intelligence, fear, and ambition, and he was determined to fight for every inch of it. Yet the combination of internal betrayal, law enforcement pressure, and relentless gang violence was eroding the foundations of everything he had worked to create. The streets of Liverpool were no longer under his control, and the world he had dominated was slipping through his fingers. Every clash, every attack, and every confrontation served as a reminder that power in the criminal underworld is fragile, and even the most formidable figures are only one mistake away from downfall. The empire that LankyPanda had spent years building finally began to crumble in a series of events that moved faster than anyone could anticipate. It was not a single misstep or one act of betrayal that brought him down, but a combination of internal treachery, relentless police operations, and the unyielding pressure of rival gangs. His once feared name, whispered with awe and dread across Liverpool, now became synonymous with vulnerability. The man who had seemed untouchable, whose reach extended across neighborhoods and criminal networks, was suddenly exposed and powerless to stop the collapse around him. The tipping point came when law enforcement, acting on months of meticulously gathered intelligence, launched a coordinated operation targeting LankyPanda's core operations. Key properties were raided simultaneously, luxury vehicles and cash reserves were seized, and trusted lieutenants were arrested with damning evidence. The operation was executed with precision, leaving LankyPanda with little room to maneuver. His communications were intercepted, his movements tracked, and the network he had relied on for years began to unravel in real time. Every ally who had once been loyal was now a potential liability, and the paranoia that had shadowed him for years became a crushing reality. In the midst of this chaos, betrayal struck from within. The lieutenant who had secretly collaborated with rival gangs revealed critical details at precisely the wrong moment, exposing the locations of hidden assets and operational plans. LankyPanda's ability to respond was hampered by both surprise and the realization that the empire he had trusted so completely was being dismantled from the inside. What had once been a network of calculated efficiency became a patchwork of exposed vulnerabilities, each one magnifying the other. The streets of Liverpool, once under his control, became a landscape of danger where every move carried risk. As rival gangs sensed his weakening grip, violence escalated further. Attempts to defend territories failed, as the coordinated chaos of law enforcement and enemy factions left little room for countermeasures. LankyPanda's reputation for fearlessness could no longer protect him. It was no longer deterrence, but a target. Safe houses were compromised, couriers captured, and operations halted mid-execution. The man who had once orchestrated the city from the shadows was forced into hiding, moving cautiously and relying on dwindling trust to survive. The arrest of LankyPanda marked the final stage of his downfall. Taken in a high-profile raid, his capture was the culmination of years of meticulous planning by authorities and the inevitable consequences of betrayal. The media quickly sensationalized the event, painting a vivid picture of the feared gangster brought low. His luxury possessions were catalogued and confiscated. Associates faced lengthy sentences, and the empire he had built practically overnight began to vanish. For the public, it was a shocking spectacle. For those who had lived in the shadows of his power, it was a moment of relief and astonishment. Behind bars, LankyPanda faced the reality of his miscalculations and overconfidence. Every decision, every act of ambition, had led him to this point. The streets that had once celebrated his rise now bore silent witness to his fall. His empire, built on fear, intelligence, and loyalty, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. The man who had once commanded respect and terror now served as a stark reminder that in the world of crime, no power is permanent, and every empire, no matter how formidable, can collapse in a single unstoppable wave of events. After LankyPanda's arrest, the full scale of his criminal empire began to emerge, revealing secrets that stunned both authorities and the public. What had appeared to be a local gang's operations was, in fact, part of a much larger, intricately organized network. Investigators discovered hidden bank accounts, offshore holdings, and carefully concealed properties purchased under false names. The luxury cars, high-end homes, and expensive watches that once symbolized his power were evidence of the wealth accumulated through years of illicit activity. Each discovery painted a picture of a man who had not only dominated Liverpool's streets, but had quietly extended his reach across the UK. The deeper authorities dug, the more connections they uncovered. LankyPanda had cultivated relationships with other crime networks, both domestically and internationally. Smuggling routes spanned multiple cities, with drugs and cash moving through a series of intermediaries to avoid detection. Corruption also played a role, as investigators traced payments and favors to individuals in business and local politics, who had unknowingly or sometimes knowingly aided his operations. LankyPanda had built a web so complex that even seasoned detectives were surprised by the scope of his influence. Perhaps most shocking were the details of his financial operations. Hidden ledgers, encrypted devices, and secret accounts revealed billions of pounds flowing through the empire. Each transaction was carefully structured to avoid suspicion, often disguised as legitimate business dealings. Offshore accounts were used to shield money from authorities, while shell companies provided a legal facade for illegal profits. The level of sophistication suggested that LankyPanda had not only street smarts, but a strategic mind capable of orchestrating an empire that blurred the lines between criminality and legitimate enterprise. Alongside financial revelations, investigators uncovered the human cost of his empire. Informants and former associates spoke of the fear and coercion that had sustained his power. Violence had been a constant tool, from intimidation and assaults to disappearances of those who resisted his authority. Communities that had once lived under silent terror shared stories of his reach and ruthlessness, confirming that the myth of LankyPanda was rooted in real fear and control. Yet these stories also revealed moments of cunning and strategy that had allowed him to survive law enforcement scrutiny for so long. The most unexpected discoveries came in the form of alliances with organized crime rings in Europe. Investigators traced shipments of narcotics and illicit funds to partners in Spain, the Netherlands, and beyond. LankyPanda's network was part of a larger ecosystem of crime, showing how a local gangster could wield influence far beyond his home city. The revelations sent shockwaves through law enforcement, highlighting vulnerabilities in regional and international monitoring systems. It became clear that what had seemed like a contained criminal operation was in reality a sophisticated enterprise with global implications. As the investigation concluded, the public and authorities alike gained a new understanding of the true scale of LankyPanda's empire. No longer just a story of street-level dominance, his rise and fall became a lesson in ambition, greed, and the intricate structures of organized crime. The man who had once appeared unstoppable was revealed to be a single figure within a vast interconnected network, an empire built on secrecy, fear, and intelligence, yet vulnerable to betrayal, law enforcement, and the relentless scrutiny of those determined to expose the truth. Even after LankyPanda was imprisoned, his legend refused to fade. In Liverpool, and across the UK, his name continued to evoke fear and fascination. The streets he once controlled still whispered his story, and his rise and fall became a benchmark for what ambition, cunning and ruthlessness could achieve, and how quickly it could unravel. For young criminals, he was both a cautionary tale and, paradoxically, an inspiration, a figure whose audacity and strategic mind seemed larger than life. But for the communities that had lived under his shadow, his empire left scars that would take years to heal. The consequences of his reign extended far beyond the individual arrests and seized assets. Former associates faced trials and convictions, leaving behind families and communities torn apart. Neighborhoods that had been under his control experienced temporary relief, but also new instability, as rival factions scrambled to fill the power vacuum. In some cases, the absence of a dominant figure led to petty violence and turf disputes, revealing how deeply his influence had been embedded in the local criminal ecosystem. LankyPanda's downfall had ended his personal rule, but it could not erase the system he had helped create. Public fascination with his story only grew as details of his operations became widely known. News outlets reported on his wealth, his calculated methods, and the intricate web of crime he had constructed. Documentaries, podcasts, and online forums dissected every element of his empire, analyzing his tactics, his rise to power, and the mistakes that led to his capture. The narrative became larger than the man himself, a symbol of the allure and peril of organized crime. People were captivated not just by the crimes he committed but by the intelligence, audacity, and strategy that had allowed him to dominate for so long. Inside prison, LankyPanda faced a different kind of reality. No longer untouchable, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. His empire had dissolved, his allies had been arrested or turned against him, and the freedom he had once wielded with confidence was gone. The isolation of incarceration contrasted sharply with the power and luxury he had enjoyed outside. He became a figure both respected and feared within the prison walls, a living reminder to others that crime could elevate a person to unimaginable heights. But that downfall was inevitable when loyalty faltered, law enforcement tightened, and the stakes became too high. Yet his story also served as a broader lesson. Law enforcement agencies studied his methods, understanding how a local gangster had built an empire that reached across regions and even international borders. Communities, journalists, and policymakers reflected on how fear and ambition could shape neighborhoods, influence young people, and distort lives. LankyPanda's legacy was not just in his crimes, but in the awareness his rise and fall created. A reminder of the fragility of power, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the inevitable consequences of living outside the law. In the end, LankyPanda's story became a cautionary tale etched into the collective memory of Liverpool. He remained a legend, not because of his triumphs, but because of the speed and scale of his downfall. The empire he built, the fear he inspired, and the secrets he left behind ensured that his name would be remembered for generations. His life proved that in the world of organized crime, no matter how brilliant or bold, every empire has an end, and every rise carries the seeds of its own destruction. The streets of Liverpool moved on, but the shadow of LankyPanda lingered, a constant reminder that power without trust, loyalty, and foresight is always fleeting.